Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Console Room 2023. Today we're going to be talking about 50 years of Season 10, and by Season 10 we mean Jon Pertwee's fourth season, not Peter Capaldi's last. This is being pre-recorded on December 17th, 2022, but we'll be seeing you live on 2023 at the convention. And I am Michael Zecca. I'm, I suppose, moderating today, and I want to pass around the rest of my panel to introduce themselves. So I want to start with Rob.
Hey, how are you? My name is Rob Levy, and I am a writer, podcaster, and huge Doctor Who fan. I've written for Anglotopia.net and books for ATB Press and Cosmic Press, and happy to be here.
And Arnold.
I'm Arnold T. Blumberg, and most relevant to this is I'm the owner of ATB Publishing. We've published several books about Doctor Who history, from Red, White, and Who to various outside-in collections, with a new one coming out soon. And just delighted to be here. Always happy to participate in Console Room.
And last but not least, Gabby.
Hi, I'm Gabby Santiago. I'm also a writer. My most recent publication was The Haunting of the Plaza de la Beneficencia Pinkberry in Professor Charlatan Bardot's anthology of the most haunted buildings in the weird wide world, which co-won the Shirley Jackson Award for Best Anthology. So I've also been a Doctor Who fan for about 15 years now. Starting with New Who, burned through that really quick, and then just super fell in love with Classic Who.
I think I'm approaching 42 years with the show.
Good number.
Yeah. All right. Well, so we're talking about Season 10, and I think we're just going to go chronologically here. So we'll start off with the first ever multi-Doctor anniversary special, The Three Doctors by Bob Baker and Dave Martin.
I think the first thing that occurs to me is how absolutely mind-blowing it must have been for that generation of fan to see, I mean, 2.5 doctors really, but all 3 doctors actually on screen together. We're so used to this idea now, and I'm definitely in the camp of one of the people that absolutely loves any excuse to put them in the same room. I've never understood I get it. If somebody feels that way, fine. But I've never understood the animosity toward multi-doctor stuff. Like, oh, don't do that. Or like, let's not do that often. No, throw them in a room every single episode is what I want. That's fine. But the amazing impact this must have had to a fan tuning in with no internet, no preparation, a Radio Times thing, and to see them all together, I can't imagine the joy that this one must have had. And I have it on the screen right now because I face the television down here in the basement, so I have BritBox on. I thought, I'll put Season 10 on while we're talking so I can have the atmosphere. So, I mean, it must have been amazing. I don't think we can ever recapture that, but that's for the first thing I think of.
Yeah, I think I am with you on that as well. I actually wrote about this for ATB in a book coming out, and
Sure.
I picked this one when I had a choice to pick episodes because, one, I like you, am captivated by the moment of it, but I also just love how it's got this sort of like warmth and sweetness to it that the show didn't necessarily always have up until then. And as much as they probably did not necessarily get along great when they were filming it, watching Pertwee and Troughton joust is amazing. I would love to have seen that in real time. And I love sort of like the nostalgia of it, the kitsch of it, but then I'm looking at it through the lens of 35 or whatever years. In the actual moment, the friends I know who have saw it when it came out said that they were just absolutely mind blown when they saw Hartnell, because they hadn't seen him in so long. And even though Troughton had just left, it was weird seeing him in color.
Mm-hmm.
So
wow.
there's a whole lot of stuff here, and there's a whole lot of things you kind of overlook and just goof at. But it's very much, to me, what the magic of classic Doctor Who is all about. It is when you say a classic magical episode, that's it. I mean, it's just great, and it has its moments where it's a little draggy, but for the most part, you get a lot of bang for your buck in terms of moments, right? And I love that. It sort of established the moments in multi-doctor stories where, side characters realize, oh my God, there's two of them. What are we doing? And it kind of really sort of served as a template for how we do Gallifrey stories too, which I think is also important.
Yeah, and I think it's just such a well-structured episode in terms of the characters you get and how they work together. Everybody has a function and keeps the interest going. The squabbles with 2 and 3, Jo and Benton keeping everybody focused so they don't just devolve into endless bickering. Someone on Tumblr described it as a brigadier reaction video to Doctor Who, and I think that's just a really excellent description because he has so many wonderful, exasperated moments of humor in it. Like when he's like, so this is what you've been doing with unit funds and equipment, and just simply refusing to believe there can be more than one doctor. Every character has just a lovely little moment of either creating tension or resolving tension to move the plot along. And there's also, like you said, in terms of creating a template for future stories, there's so many lovely moments that will be future callbacks in future multi-doctor episodes or just regular episodes, like the "you've redecorated, don't like it." Just a lot of really lovely moments.
I was going to say, Rob, in addition to it being the first time people saw Troughton in color, it's the first time and only time that they saw Hartnell in color as the Doctor, which is pretty amazing too.
Yeah, but he's in Magnavox.
He is.
Yeah.
People have to remember too, given the time that this happened, this is only the second time we've seen Gallifrey in the series. So in the modern era, we're pretty burned out on Gallifrey, and we did the Time War to get it out of the way because the Gallifrey continuity was getting too heavy. But this is still the early days of building the Time Lord lore, and Omega is a huge addition to that lore. It wasn't until a few years later that Robert Holmes started to flesh out Rassilon and all that we actually learned of Omega first, which is pretty amazing. So this is, the Doctor meeting one of his heroes and then finding out both how he was harmed and also how he has kind of turned somewhat bad because of what's happened. So yeah, he's very, very mixed on the resolution because of that. I want to say also in terms of the story structure, I really love that Bob Baker and Dave Martin definitely followed the playwright Chekhov. There's a whole thing about if you're going to have somebody shoot somebody in Act 5 of the play, the revolver needs to be on the mantelpiece in Act 1. The recorder disappears early in the story, and Troughton makes a point of it. Mm-hmm. And it comes into play very importantly at the end of the resolution of the story.
And Jo's flowers as well. She just kind of tosses them down, and you're like, oh, okay, I guess. And then later it comes back as an important plot point of, oh, that's how they managed to escape from Omega.
I also have to say, I used to... my mother used to love the Pertwee era, I think probably best of all the classic Doctor Who that we shared together and that we watched together. And one of her favorite lines ever that I think is not only a great line, but also I think kind of perfectly encapsulates a central theme or a central philosophy of this character, no matter who the Doctor is or what aspect they have in a given moment. The Doctor is all about this idea, and it's when Jo says that they're dead, and he says it's a place. It's like any other place. And it's this beautiful idea of look, we're conscious, we're aware, we're experiencing reality. It doesn't matter. He's not even discounting that they're dead. He's just saying, well, we're here, so let's go look, And it's just such a beautiful moment. And I think that's one of those main moments, even up to the present, with Jodie Whittaker's Doctor, this joy of travel and travel hopefully and the joy of discovery. And that's right there too, is that idea of, look, as long as you can see and experience whatever in some form, it's not terrible. It's life, so always like that part.
I always like the fact too that this is very much the opening salvo for the viewer, that this is going to be a season of transition and movement and fluidity. And I think that upon hindsight, they do it really well, in real time, this must have just freaked people out. I would have loved to have seen it just because, like, wait a minute, what? This person's here, they're not on, just there's a lot of change going on. And they really were smart in that they wrapped that rapid change of the show in a lot of nostalgia to sort of kick off the season. And I know we'll get to that later, but that was a really smart move doing this first, because it really hooked people in and baited the hook for what was coming. But it also celebrated everything that was great about the show. And what it does do that a lot of the other sort of multi-doctor specials necessarily haven't is it does all the nostalgia stuff, but it also laid a ton of groundwork for stuff in the future. And I don't know how much of that was intentional, right? But so much of this story is impacted by other doctors later. Like, it really does a nice job for setting the canon table, because like she said, you get the recorder here, you get this there, and you get some of the characterizations of different things, but it's a really great reference point, I think, for other shows later, which is one of the ways that it sort of stood the test of time.
Mm.
And we get a little bit of foreshadowing, I think, even of the season end, because we've got this ending of this episode where the doctor's excited to travel again, and Jo wants to go home. That's the planet she wants to see. And we know that that's eventually going to become the thing where the doctor always travels, always leaves, but Jo is committed to her planet and to protecting it. And I think it's also interesting, you mentioned earlier, this is one of the very first glimpses of starting to build the Time Lords. And we've got like that darkness right from the beginning, that dark underbelly of Time Lord culture.
This is also the first time we heard of the first law of time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a big point made of that. First time really seeing Gallifrey in a major way. We kind of sort of saw it briefly in the War Games, but it was just 2 Time Lords we saw. And now we got a whole room full of them doing stuff. It's
wearing very inconvenient shoulder pads.
Yeah. I mean, the
like, aren't they smacking into things all the time? I don't know.
I mean, the War Room from Day of the Doctor is just a logical evolution of this. So
yeah. Actually, should mention, by the way, was it James Acheson, right? Design of costuming and that Omega mask, which is just a simple thing, but is so very Doctor Doom-like, and feels like it was probably riffing on it a little, which is all the more interesting because there's a whole history of the Target novel of this, like lifting some art from a Fantastic Four cover, so it's all connected. Oh, not that one. There's the Omega one.
Another variation.
But yeah, the design of Omega is just beautiful. The Gel Guard's not so much, maybe, but Omega is just a beautiful design. That face is like amazingly expressive for something that stays still, and it just all the more makes it so impressive when you do the big reveal and they take the thing off, and it's just beautiful stuff. I just love the look of it.
It helps that Stephen Thorne was under the mask.
Yes,
I mean, his voice does so much for that character. So, and honestly, you said about the Gel Guards, I didn't mind that design so much. The way they hopped around was a little silly, but it's a children's show in 1973.
And they're also supposed to be fake. Yeah, I mean, they're supposed to be created.
But I mean, when we talk about design, you compare that to, say, the Plesiosaurus and the Drashigs in the next story, and I think the design of the Gel Guards is far better.
Sure.
I mean, something about the whole concept of like, this is a realm created purely by intellect and will makes me like, these weird abstract things, totally buy it. Totally makes sense. I'm completely suspending my disbelief. The concept is so simple, but so chilling, and it works so well.
One of the things too, is that the sparseness of the sets, in terms of like the lighting, and even when, they're filming obviously in a quarry and stuff, the sets being so sparse and so sort of esoteric really lends it almost to a theater presence, but it also really brings the characters and the dramas to the forefront. And I think that is where Stephen Thorpe really got to bring this to the core, because he's almost Shakespearean in how he portrays Omega. And I think if he's in a set that's bogged down with bright colors or gadgets or gizmos, or like in a spaceship or something, that effect is lost. So I think the term less is better is great. And even the TARDIS set, although it's brightly lit, it's a muted light from some of the other times that we've seen. And it's also very sparse. They didn't clutter the TARDIS with a whole lot of things. And I think that the way that they draped it in light and the way that they set up the sets is terrific, as opposed to Carnival of Monsters, which is like overkill of like stuff everywhere, right? So I love that minimalist sort of way that they framed the action with it.
And I think that's a good lead into our next story, Carnival of Monsters, a second story of season 10, and the first story in which the Doctor is able to travel under his own power in a few years. So what do we want to say about Carnival of Monsters?
I've always considered this my least favorite of the season, but only in comparison. And really, there are times I've revisited it where I have a lot of fun with it. Again, it's one of those things where if you want to criticize stuff, you can. You can find things. I mean, in this one, there's a few. Like we already mentioned, the Drashig. Okay, maybe not the best hand puppet monster in the world, but the Drashigs are still kind of cute and scary. And the gray makeup on the for the alien group there is maybe not the best and everything. But there's a lot in this too that's also really, really good. Again, talking about set design, the stuff about them inside the scope is like she was saying before about the quality of the look of the creation of Omega's world. You go to Carnival of Monsters, and now you've created this beautiful, almost abstract, artsy kind of look at what the inside of a machine is. It doesn't look like the inside of a machine. It's also alien too. It just looks like this otherworldly Alice in Wonderland weird kind of thing, and it's so nice for the simplest shots of them just sitting around talking with each other, which was always a highlight of their era anyway. The Doctor and Jo getting a few minutes to just chat and him telling her some silly story about polka dots or something or other. And it's the joy of those two characters together. So there's a lot of stuff in this to recommend it.
Arnold, I was going to say, for those of us that grew up on Disney's Tron, the feel of the inside of the machine worked just fine.
Yeah. Exactly.
I would agree with you that this is not my favorite story. It's probably my least favorite Pertwee era story, to be honest. And it kind of is the Mark Gatiss episode of the season. It's not terrible, but it just doesn't stand out for me either. But I gave it a rewatch last night to give it another chance. And yeah, there's a lot of complexity to the story. I'm a huge Robert Holmes stan, and I don't think this is his strongest story, but you can see him trying to do several things at once in this story. There's all the political machinations amongst the aliens in this world. There's multiple intelligent species on this world. And so there's some criticism of British colonialism and racism in there. Then you've got the carnies coming in, and there's a lot of criticism about zoos and circuses and treatment of animals. And then you've got just all those different worlds inside as well. And plus, we do see quite a lot of Doctor Who creations from the Pertwee era in this story. We get a Sea Devil, we get an Ogron, we get a Cyberman. It's like the only time in Pertwee's era where we encounter a Cyberman is in this story in the Miniscope. So, yeah.
Yeah. For me, the story is just delightfully silly. Like, I'm not going to go watch Doctor Who and complain about a story being silly. Like, that's ridiculous. So I love it when a show does a swing and they just put all their effort into that swing. Like going to New Who, yes, the universe took the shape of a frog. Excellent. Best. Of course, the Master is dancing as Rasputin. And here we have some carnies that have accidentally captured the Doctor and Jo, and they're wearing little pom-poms all over their clothes for no reason. And sure, there's some planet ending stakes, but there's also the stakes of like their import-export licenses. And I just kind of love the random silliness of it. And even with the humor, there's still like little moments of creepiness, like the repeating things on the ship as the time goes over. And there's lovely character moments. And yeah, I'm like, it's a silly episode, but I don't take that as a knock against it.
And one quick thing I wanted to add that you just kind of made me think of. I've never really thought about it before. In a weird way, you could almost say the Miniscope is sort of like a little metaphor for Doctor Who itself.
Exactly.
It's a show that can go anywhere, be anything, takes big swings, includes all different weird worlds, and you don't know what's around the next corner. And that's the Miniscope, really. So, yeah.
So this was my introduction to the Jon Pertwee Doctor.
Hmm.
And it was, like lots of us, I saw it on PBS, and it was like 1:15 in the morning because it was delayed getting shown. And I didn't love it like the first 2 or 3 times I saw it. It really took me a little longer. I always loved the novelization more than the episode, right? Um, but it really took me a while to get past just the complete weirdness of the costumes, with the mirrors and all. What is this, right? This is odd, right? Which is great for Doctor Who. I love that. But it really took me a while to look past it. Oddly enough, I'm fine with, the aliens and the things that they do in it, but just the costuming is just like bizarrely strange. It's like, what drugs were these people on when they were, that's sort of the first thing I thought of, right? And then as you get to it, it sort of carries over some of that lightness and warmth that we get in Three Doctors. And it's going to get dark. You see little twitches of it that this is going to slowly start getting weird. But I just the thing that I've learned to really appreciate it is the way Pertwee sort of uses the other co-stars that he is acting with to really accentuate his performance as the Doctor, meaning like this is my idea of the Doctor, whatever, but he really in this episode acts well off of the guest stars to sort of ramp up his own performance. And I don't know whether that was a comfort thing or what, but through time I've learned to really like this as one of my favorite Pertwee ones. It's my least favorite of this season. But it's also outside of the Three Doctors, the one that I kind of recommend the Third Doctor to people that are like watching the new series and want to go to the old series, that may not have the patience for an Ambassadors of Death or a longer story, right? And I think it's really an interesting episode of what Doctor Who can do with the imagination of the mind, right? Because when you're watching this, you sort of suspend your disbelief a little bit with some of it, and you really get caught up in it, but you also sort of fall to this thing that we did a lot more in the Tom Baker years, where we ignore the crappy sets, we ignore the weird costumes, and we just really focus on the story. This is the first time I sort of had to really do that as a fan.
I guess in terms of the light, silly, the running about back and forth between realms and all the little things going on. In some ways, this felt like Robert Holmes writing Christmas Panto. But it's Robert Holmes doing it, which is why there's all this serious stuff over Woolwood and everything. So, yeah. And the whole thing with the I'm forgetting their names, but the characters that Michael Wisher and the other fellows in the alien world, and the way they have all those just moments with each other talking. It's very much reminiscent of that Robert Holmes things where he introduces two interesting guest characters to every episode that are paired together, like Jago and Lightfoot, like Karen and Stuff, and so on. It's that same dynamic, except he's got a third one in the mix this time. Yeah,
it's interesting too. Like all the years of when you grew up in a certain era of Doctor Who fandom, I mean, you know what I'm talking about. Like we read all the books and we've become used to certain phrases and received fan wisdom that really I've tried to spend a lot of time trying to shake off now too, because there's whole new generations of people that are equally fans who have a much more interesting and fresh take on things, and we're mired in a lot of these old ideas that you got to let go of. But one of the things I'm fascinated by, like for instance, is we always say things like the Robert Holmes double act, right?
Yeah.
And it's true. I mean, it's true. It's there. But really, it's like what it really is just saying is it's good, solid, basic writing for a script where, well, I got this scene. I want to move things forward. I also want the audience to know something about them. Well, how do you do that? You need to have a character talk to another character. So you do pairs. It's just, it's like he didn't make magic. He's a good writer. Yeah. And in Doctor Who terms, we're like, wow, the Holmesian double act. And it's like, yes, because he is a good writer and he knows that you have people talk to people. And that's how you get to know what's going on and who they are. And yeah, and you see, and you're right, great evidence of that nice basic storytelling approach in this.
And I think sorry, go ahead, Gabby.
I was just going to say this was the episode of the season that Barry Letts chose to be able to direct. So I think you also see some of his influence on there. He is one of my favorite directors and producers of classic Who, just wonderful, warm touch.
Gabby, are you saying there's some CSO in this episode? Barry Letts did love his CSO.
That too.
I was going to say, Arnold, I think the thing is that Holmes often used the double act to convey that information using two new characters, where
Yes.
most of the other writers in Doctor Who, including the new era, usually have that conversation going on between a guest character and the companion.
Mm.
And so
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
what's interesting with Holmes is he brings in new blood to do this frequently, which makes those characters more interesting and rich as guest
Right.
characters.
Both as outsiders, right?
Yes, yes. All right, well, we should probably move on to the next story. And for me, this is one of those stories that I read as a Target novelization before I saw it on screen and absolutely fell in love with it. There were really two of those I just solidly fell in love with. One was Patrick Troughton's The Enemy of the World, and the other is Frontier in Space, which in novel form was called Doctor Who and the Space War. So one thing I want to say about this one right up front is that there was some a big shift in the mask and makeup that they do in Doctor Who with this story. Up until now, you either just did makeup on the face, like with those Great Aliens and Carnival of Monsters and the Ogrons, or you did a full rubber mask like the Silurians. And in this case, they did this half mask thing where the Draconians have a headpiece that comes down but leaves the mouth free and the eyes free, so the actor can emote. And I think this really helped solidify the Draconians. Not to mention that there's this rich culture there. I always have bristled at the Brits when they refer to Doctor Who monsters. Like, okay, I get you could call Agador a monster or Kroll a monster, but Cybermen might be monstrous, but they're a whole race of people. And the Draconians for me are max level, a race of people, not just a monster. They're on par with the Klingons or the Romulans in Star Trek to me. And I really feel terrible we've never seen them again in the series. I would love to revisit the time period of this story, or a little before or a little after, in the new series. I think there's a lot that could be done with the mind that is here.
I love the Draconians so much, and also could never understand why they've never been back all these years, and they'd be so easy to accomplish today. Don't redesign them even. You don't need to. They're perfect.
Yeah.
And I love this story. I mentioned my mother I'm doing this more as a tribute for her, is that there are things we shared that like are particularly special. Frontier in Space was the main story. Absolutely loved it. If we're going to put a Pertwee on to watch again, Frontier in Space. And I am as keenly aware as anyone that it also is based very strongly on the idea that we need to fill 6 episodes. So how about we have people escape one group and get caught by another group, and then escape that group and get caught by another group again? I get it. Okay. I'm still willing to sit through all 6 because it's awesome. It's some of the most amazing early like universe building in Doctor Who. I love the attitude in this that in some modern Doctor Who, at least initially, stepped away from, which is like Russell, for instance, had that conceit that every time the Daleks came back, they had to be thoroughly wiped out only to come back again. I love the stuff in things like Frontier in Space where it's like, look, there's just a universe out there all the time. The Daleks are out there all the time. They're going to be doing other stuff. They're not fighting the Doctor every minute. They're existing. And Frontier in Space feels like a universe of cultures and planets. And I love that there's a woman who's president of Earth, and this is the 1970s, and they're doing more here on this show than American shows are doing for decades after. And she's a strong character who gets to say, look, you got to listen to me about there's wonderful character stuff. I love the subtleties, like the little moment that I think everybody points to where the guys, all the Ogrons were played by like football players and ex-cons, and they were evidently all like delightfully like just delighted to work around Katie Manning. So there's that one scene where they like push her into the scene because they're really mad Gurr and they've taken her prisoner, but the second he walks past her, he puts his hand on her back really gently when he moves by because he doesn't want to hurt her. And I love that. It's these little tiny things. I just love everything about this story. And the Draconians, the one thing I would say is there might be, I can see some genuine issues with the fact that to a certain extent, some of the Draconian culture looks like there's some cultural appropriation stuff, and that's clearly based on some Asian stereotypes. And all I would say is that would need to be thought through carefully if they were going to bring the Draconians back and make something that's proper and sensitive to what those issues might be. But I think they're still a viable group that could be used very well in the modern show. It just has to be done with thought.
And I love the fact that they, incorporated some of those cultures into their character, because it's a culture that hadn't been incorporated in Doctor Who very well before, if at all. But you're totally right about the need to revamp that if they brought him back. This is another one that I wish I could have seen in real time, because the time that it airs is sort of just the apex of like the cultural phenomenon of space travel. We put a man on the moon, we're doing follow-up moon missions and other things. And I think that when they're making Doctor Who, they realized that people are really interested in space exploration and going out there. And it's a kind of big leap for the show, right? And I love that it took its leap and it was Base Under Siege, sort of, right? Like all the Matt Smith Base Under Siege stories that we got later sort of hark back to this, right? Because you're like, oh no, they're getting in the airlock, and they're coming, it builds suspense. I also think that this is probably the best use of incidental music in the season. Just the way that the incidental music sort of builds the drama up is good. And, Katie Manning's great in it. Pertwee's great in it. Draconians just look menacing in a way that villains hadn't before. And I use the words villains lightly, but you know what I mean. Baddies of the week or whatever, right? They just look really great, and it is like the complete opposite of Carnival of Monsters. It's like, what? Oh, that budget was because this one was gone. Yeah, and it feels claustrophobic. It feels, when you watch it, you feel threatened. You also feel hopeful, that people have expanded out in the galaxy. So seeing this one in real time would have been interesting too, especially in the Cold War as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you get a lot of that tension there, because so often with Doctor Who, the stakes are like so big and so distant, but like warring states of whatever size miscommunicating and having conflict because of different cultural understandings of what things mean, or just malfunctions. Like that's something that's very understandable and relatable, and it makes it super tense and really holds the interest across episodes. And I think in addition to that, and like as other people have said, the complexity of the antagonists, another thing that just makes these episodes a delight to watch is the triple act of Katie Manning, Jon Pertwee, and Roger Delgado. Like the three of them have just such excellent chemistry. Like it is a very musical chairs with cells, but it's just so fun to watch the three of them navigate that game of musical chairs with their cheerful antagonism and all the little tricks they play on each other, like blocking the camera and nattering on to make sure the Doctor can escape. There's just a lot of really fun moments with the trio of them that you can see why people are still falling in love with the three of them decades later. And of course, Jo Grant has her just outstanding iconic moment when the Master tries to hypnotize her, and she's just like, I will simply choose not to be hypnotized by the Master. Yeah. Just like, nope, just gonna recite nursery rhymes at you. And he's just like, fine. Like, yeah, Jo Grant just pwned you.
Yeah, she's like, you did this to me once, we're not going there again.
Three quick things I'm going to add, if it's okay, because this story is so big to me. One is, you're absolutely right. And it's the rare occasion where it feels like the modern show, in that a companion got to have an emotional and personality arc, where she's introduced in her first story as a victim of the Master. And here we get the conclusion of that, which was wonderful. And like a look forward. The other thing is, we talked about Draconians as monsters and villains, which they function as for a part of the story. But one of the things that I think is beautiful about the story is, particularly through a 2022 lens, it's a story about having empathy for the other. Yeah. And the Draconians are honorable and good people who just think the same bad things about us that we were thinking about them. And one of the key moments I love is, I can't remember his name now, but when the president's right-hand man, who was evidently involved in the incident that initially sparked conflict,
General Williams.
thank you. And he's confronted by the truth, by the Draconian delegation. When I used to see it younger, I was kind of thrown by the fact that he so quickly believes them when they tell him that they weren't armed and that everything, and he was wrong. As an adult, I look at it and I think, no, that plays perfectly well, because you get the impression he probably has always thought all his life that maybe he made a mistake. And this is just the moment where he finds out he's right. And then the rest of it is they're fast friends, they're working together. This is a beautiful look at what's possible.
Yeah.
And I will say one last thing, which is that when I went to London, the one and only time I've ever visited England with a friend who lives there, he asked me if I wanted to see Big Ben or Tower of London or things like that. And I was like, no, you can just take me to the building where Pertwee's running around and escaping from. So we went to the big concrete building from Frontier in Space, and I was delighted. So.
I was going to say too, in terms of the Draconians, you were saying, that they're just good people who have the same feelings about us. But I think what's interesting, and this is Malcolm Hulke and his socialist trends, it's the humans who have a racist term for Draconians, but not the other way around.
Yeah.
And that is typical of humans, unfortunately.
You see that guy ranting on the screen in that one scene in the news report, and I'm
of
thinking,
course he's a redneck.
haven't we seen that a lot lately?
Yeah. And of course he's a redneck. And that was the beautiful story. There's a lot of diversity of the Earth culture. And again, this is classic socialist Malcolm Hulke here, but this is an Earth government with a woman president who was played by a Czech-born actress. There's a newsreader at one point who is clearly supposed to be African.
Yeah.
Who actually is played by an actor, Lewis, I think Mahoney, who was in Blink as the older version of Billy.
Yeah.
After the Angels aged him out. We see a variety of Earth cultures all working together in this grander universe because things have changed over several centuries. And that was refreshing to see. This story was Doctor Who doing space opera, and they did it well. But also, I think if you look at the set design in the story, the costume design in the story, the model shots they were doing, this was the grounding for the set design and model effects and costuming we would see on Blake 7 a few years later as well, which was a huge Terry Nation space opera. So, and speaking of Terry Nation, as we see at the end of this story, Frontier in Space actually connects with the subsequent story, Planet of the Daleks. They were sort of trying to do these two as sort of a new Dalek master plan, but a little looser. But when I talk about continuity, not only do we have that continuity with the Daleks into the next story, but if you think into this story, when the Ogrons were using that little sonic projector to manipulate the humans into thinking they're seeing something else, you see the thing you most fear. The humans would see the Draconians. The Draconians would see humans. Joe Grant sees Drashigs. Now, for me, seeing this out of context when I first read it, like, what's the point? When you watch them out of order, it doesn't make sense. When you realize this comes immediately after Carnival of Monsters, Drashigs are still very much in her mind. I don't think if we had done this story later in the season, Drashigs would have been the first thing that came to her mind. But right now, they're on her mind. Anyway, Planet of the Daleks is where we're heading next. So at the end of the story, Frontier in Space, we discovered the Master and the Ogrons were doing this big plot between the Earth and Draconians to loosen them up for a Dalek invasion. And now we head to Planet of the Daleks, where the Doctor's trying to stave that off. And this is Terry Nation coming back to the show. So let's talk.
I will say that I've never particularly cared for a lot of this one. Mainly, and again, I gotta keep trying to do caveats. It's like, all Doctor Who at this era I can sit and watch. It's not like anything is terrible. I wouldn't necessarily put Planet of the Daleks on. I always felt like it was a little bit of a letdown after Frontier in Space. It does feel like things kind of grind to a halt from that style. It's like we're just saying, it's so expansive, so much space opera. And although we didn't know until the full story until years later as fans, but also Frontier in Space is such an sort of unsatisfying, abrupt send-off for Roger Delgado, sadly. So there's like all these things. And then Planet of the Daleks feels a little insular, like all of a sudden everything is very studio based and we're in another old little jungle set. And there's still some good stuff, and you got some solid actors, all of whom have sort of been on before, and like a great guest cast. But I think the main problem I have with it is that, as we all know who have been with it for years and read about it a lot, it's Terry Nation again, basically writing the same story over again. He does all his same beats, and it's so obvious at points that it's just like, well, if I want to watch this story, I could watch the original one from before. But it still has some good stuff. And I think the nicest thing I could say about it is it continues very nicely with Katie Manning getting a chance to show Jo as a character who's very much in control of her own destiny, and getting a chance to really sort of be the lead for a good part of this story. And that, if nothing else, I think is what you could use to say that Planet of the Daleks is worthwhile and still something to recommend, because it really gives her a chance to shine.
Yeah, as I was preparing for this panel, I was trying to cast my mind back to the plot of Planet of the Daleks. And really, the things that stick out in my memory are Jo and Jo's relationship to the Doctor and seeking help for him. And like, I'm always going to enjoy those parts of it because just I'm a sucker for one character being injured or ill and the other character trying to rescue them or care for them. It's great. You get two characters who care about each other, you get to see one of them endangered. Sign me up. I love the Arsenal of Freedom from Star Trek The Next Generation. It's a good time. I'll watch that endlessly. I did have to like refresh myself on what else happened in the plot, but who cares? Jo Grant caring for the Doctor. The end. Great.
I'm going to
That
say
wraps that up.
there's a couple peculiar things about the story. For me, this was the first time I saw the Thals on screen. So I didn't, get to see the original Dalek story with Hartnell till later when they did the PBS package. Initially, it was Tom Baker, and then expanding into Peter Davison. Then they added some John Pertwee in. And then after a couple loops with that, then we went all the way back to Hartnell and started seeing those. So yeah, this is my first experience with Thals face-to-face. So that was interesting. And Bernard Horsfall and the rest do a great job of conveying that. Another peculiarity with this story, the first couple times I saw it on PBS, they were aired episodically. And we only had episode 3 in black and white because the color print didn't exist anymore. So you'd watch 2 color episodes in a black and white and then 3 color, and it was no big deal to me. But when PBS started trying to save some money later, they were doing these in Hoovie format where the stories were edited together. They felt it would be too jarring to the audience to jump from color to black and white back to color, so they just left episode 3 out.
Yep.
And you jump from the
I saw it.
cliffhanger at end of season 2 in the jungle to them crawling through a tunnel.
Yeah. That's how I saw it for years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
They didn't do that for us, but they did, they put a little disclaimer on the screen. One of these episodes will be in black and white, and it scrolled across the bottom of the screen.
Yeah, I always saw the edited one. Also, when they did Invasion of the Dinosaurs, they'd always skip right to 2. And I never understood the stupidity of that. Like the audience will be jarred by black and white. Like we won't be jarred by a missing half hour of story, but all right.
Well, Arnold, in the case of Invasion of the Dinosaurs, we didn't have either black and white or color.
They didn't.
For
They
a
didn't
long
have
time.
that at all yet. Okay.
And the black and white episode 1 was recovered in the 90s, and so some of the last PBS stations that were airing it did air it complete. But for Planet of the Daleks, they air it complete first, and then they go back and show this edited version later. It was very jarring for those of us doing rewatches. There are some interesting concepts in this story, especially from the science standpoint. You've got this harsh jungle environment, but it also is like super freezing overnight. How do those plants survive that? I don't really understand the science there. But the harshness of this environment, which again reminds you of places like Kemble and the Dalek Master Plan, J. Tarnation reusing things he's done before. It does suggest why the intelligent species in that planet is invisible, to protect themselves from all the potential dangers in this environment. You also have the concept of cryovolcanoes, which are actually something that exists in the solar system. On Pluto, you have a nitrogen cycle, and you do have nitrogen in liquid form and solid form and gaseous form. Pluto forms a nitrogen atmosphere during its summer. And the cryovolcanoes are a thing. Triton, Neptune's moon, also has volcanoes that shoot, nitrogen out in liquid form. We get water volcanoes in some parts of the solar system as well.
So we got to
So
check
this,
them for Dalek armies, is what you're saying.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
yeah.
But
Okay.
this is one of those times when Doctor Who is looking at real science and doing something nice with it. Omega's antimatter universe is another one of those ideas. And then, of course, I've railed on other panels about when Doctor Who does it wrong, places like Kill the Moon. But I like that they're doing some interesting things with science concepts in this story, though there are some inconsistencies because Terry Nation's not great at some things. But but you're right. Overall, I don't enjoy the story that much. It's okay. It has an interesting concept to it. Certainly, the idea of having this hidden Dalek army and having to get rid of it before they spread out through the universe, that was a neat concept.
I think we could also just say that in terms like, since we're the whole point of the thing is we're here talking about like this anniversary of season 10, it's like we're looking at the bigger picture. It certainly made sense for an anniversary season to have a Dalek story.
Yeah.
And at a time where still they were arguably spottier in how they were using them than we're used to today, it seems like, well, that's a given. You really need to have the biggest Doctor Who adversaries show up. It's a great button at the end of Frontier in Space for the big final moment. So, for all the flaws that the story may have, it's like, well, you got to have a Dalek story in there, and why not? At that point, have the guy that wrote the Daleks give us another Dalek story. It's perfect for the anniversary, really.
And that is the largest Dalek army we've seen since Evil of the Daleks.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else we want to say about Planet of the Daleks?
I'm good.
All right. Well, then we're moving on to our season finale. So the finale for Jon Pertwee's 4th season and Jo Grant's final story, at least until Power of the Doctor. And that is The Green Death.
Or Death of the Doctor in SJA.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
True.
Yeah.
That's right.
The Green Death is probably, I think, one of my favorite Pertwee episodes of all time, but it's also one I don't watch very often because it's just so sad, the end. One of the most bittersweet companion goodbyes of just, it's a happy ending for her, but it's the end of her time with the Doctor, and the Doctor just and Bessie outside watching everybody have that happy wedding celebration party. Just my heart every time.
It's also one of those ones where that one really feels like it's a story that could very easily, with very few changes, translate well into the modern era in a way that a lot of classic Doctor Who can't or wouldn't as well, because that whole emotional through line with her and the Doctor seems very of the future of the show, including like us taking a moment to reflect on him being sad that she's leaving and, oh, I'm alone again. They didn't dwell on that much then, and it feels so much more human and real than a lot of classic Doctor Who, because they actually have the emotional thing. It's a real gut punch when she does the thing like, he's a lot like you, only younger. It's like, thanks a lot. That's great. And yeah, it's just wonderful emotional character storytelling in this, and it feels very modern, and it's very special ending for a season.
Also, that main environmentalist plot very much feels like something you'd have seen in the Chibnall era.
Yeah.
The chemicals altering the insects and all the rest. I mean, I could have seen Chibnall writing or putting a story like that into his era with Jodie easily enough.
Sure.
Yeah. And Mark Gatiss has
corporate stuff.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, Mark Gatiss has talked about how the ending influenced him too. So you can see this has been a really influential episode for a lot of folks who worked on New Who.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I was saying the strong anti-corporate kind of approach to this, which frankly, just the more time goes by, the more we realize how desperately important it is that we get everybody on the same page about this. So yeah. I mean, basically everything thematic in The Green Death could air today, and except for like the cosmetic elements, would play just as well, which is also desperately depressing because it means we haven't fixed anything. but with The Green Death, it's sadly almost a timeless story at this point. And even the maggots really work really well. I think they're pretty damn good. So yeah, it's great stuff. Like even the little, we were talking about effects a few times too. There's that great thing they've used, and they use even way into the future of the show, classic, like even in Silver Nemesis, where they use the effect of using like phosphorescent stuff or like paint that reacts to light off the side of the camera. And they do that in a little CSO for some of the Green Death itself. And it's just a great looking effect. It's just very simple, nice. It's a really strong ending for a season for any classic season.
Yeah, I think it's the strongest ending almost of the classic series in many ways. But I also think too that out of necessity for the season, they had it to end on Earth just to sort of ground it a little bit and make it a little more I don't want to say user friendly, but I think a little more familiar to the audience going into 11, right? I think as you start to sort of do the farewell tour for Pertwee, you have to sort of go back to Earth and set it in the contemporary. And I think again, this is also would be interesting to see in real time what the reaction was of people that had seen most of the season after years be set in space or away from Earth and then go back to Earth. I just wonder how that sort of played out. I think too that this is one of the stories that has really profited from being on video and being released later, because I think that as more people see it, it's a Pertwee story that, and because for the same reasons that Arnold mentioned, it still resonates, but it's also very watchable, right? All the performances are great. The guest stars are great. You have this underlying kind of love story thing going on. It's a very solid story just in terms of storytelling, right? Regardless if it's science fiction or Doctor Who, it's a very like well thought out 6-parter. It's not padded like we get in some of the other stuff in the Pertwee era, but it's also grounded, and it's got probably more so than anything since Three Doctors at the beginning of the season. It's got an emotional core to it, right? It's got like this sort of heartstring tug that you get at the beginning of the season and you get it at the end, and then in between you get like nostalgia, experimentation, all these different permeations of canon that we use later, and it's a nice bookend, I think.
Also, you reminded me of something else that's important too, that I think also sometimes, at least slips my mind sometimes, because I know there are people that really stay dedicated to like revisiting the classic show in chunks and in order. I don't. I mean, like I'll just like, oh, maybe I'll watch a Peter Davison one, or I'll watch a Pertwee or something. So I rarely see it in the order all in a piece again. But it really is something to think back on the fact that after the Three Doctors, the whole season went off to other worlds, and the Green Death is really the only really solid unit story of the whole season. Because even the Three Doctors is kind of not, since we take them into the antimatter world, and it's not quite the same. We start with the unit and kind of it disintegrates, but this one is the one single Earthbound unit story of the 10th season. And it's really odd to think, again, like we started talking about with the Three Doctors, what it must have felt like at this point to realize the show is starting to really drift off into a wider universe, and it's not going to be that Earthbound unit family thing in quite the same way anymore. But let's all get back together again for a rousing finale and go back home and do that. And that must have, again, there's an emotional context to that I would love to have felt or know what that was like at the time, because that must have really been something to say, oh, we're back with everybody again. And obviously, as we know, that was going to fade out more and more as the next couple seasons came along.
There's something I'm thinking about in retrospect as I look at the Green Death. So in the modern era, we've got Kate Stewart leading unit, and her father always tried to press on her science leads is the thing we kept hearing from Stephen Moffat. We didn't always see that with the Brig in the series, but I think in the Green Death, you're starting to see some growth in the Brig this way. Even in the Three Doctors, when, you know, he sees what the inside of the TARDIS looks like and all these weird things are happening around him, he's still kind of like, this is what you've been doing with unit funds. In this story, you got his initial response coming in as a military person into this hippie commune, but then they're feeding him something that tastes like steak, but is actually made of a fungus, and working alongside them through these 6 stories, you start to see him softening a bit and realizing, okay, the science, other things it's not always the way I've seen it. You're starting to see some growth in the Brigadier's character, which is wonderful to see. He really softens a bit by the end of this story. And it makes what Stephen Moffat wrote in Kate Stewart's mouth coming from his mouth more believable.
And of course, this episode has the seeds of Mike Yates' betrayal later on as well. So I can't imagine what that would be like to experience that for the first time of watching Invasion of the Dinosaurs and being like, oh, this is a callback to that.
Yeah. Another example, by the way, just as with Joe's arc in this season, or rather in since her debut, another example of the kind of companion or like supporting character storytelling that we've come to be very used to in modern television and modern Doctor Who, but in classic Doctor Who was a rarity. And Mike Yates gets this extraordinary multi-story plot that carries him all the way through to Planet of the Spiders and rehabilitation and redemption and everything. It's like, this really feels like a different era of television with these stories. It's a very special era for, I've always felt it's kind of sad when anybody denigrates, any of it. You like it, you don't like it, but there's always been people like the Pertwee era. It's like, no, there's a lot to recommend it. There are a lot of interesting things here especially for fans of the way television tells its stories today. They really are rewarding if you're a Doctor Who fan.
Yeah, I'm definitely someone who the Pertwee era is my favorite era of the show. Troughton's middle season is my favorite season. Pertwee's is my favorite era. Colin's my favorite Doctor. I know that doesn't fit together very well, but that's how I am. But yeah,
honestly,
Barry, when people go talk about, who's the best producer, Barry Letts. Honestly, I adore what Barry Letts did with this show. And I think the reason I like season 18, Tom Baker's last season, more than the next few years under John Nathan Turner goes down to the fact that Barry Letts was standing behind him, guiding him.
Right.
And Elizabeth Sladen has said that in retrospect, she feels like part of her character was based on Barry Letts. She based partially on a young niece, but also partly she felt on like kind of the warmth and openness and forthrightness that she felt from him.
It extends both before and after season 10, but as we've already covered individually in some of these stories, there is an attention to social issues, political issues plaguing the modern world and in the real world, even down to the simple things that we today seem to be talking about a lot, all those of us that actually are interested in progress, like things like having empathy for one another, respecting one another, treating other human beings as, human and equally deserving. And there's a lot of that kind of thematic material in season 10 of Doctor Who, oddly enough. And in a lot of the stories that the Barry Letts era told both before and after that as well. And so it's there's the chintzy stuff too, but under it all, it feels like they have their hearts in the right place with a lot of this kind of storytelling.
The other thing too about the storytelling is interesting is that you really see a progression in the Third Doctor's behavior from the beginning of the season. It is almost like the revisiting his previous selves and the influence of Joe Grant has sort of changed him near the end to where he feels emotion and sort of understands where his place is, right? There is this sort of like sense of melancholy that builds through the Green Death that ends the way that it ends. But I think that sort of little nugget is planted in Three Doctors when he kind of realizes who he is, where he's come from. And then all through the season, he has these different little moment things that happen. He meets the Master again. That causes a little bit of interesting circumspection. Most of it in the theater of the mind. But then we get near the end when Joe leaves. You sort of almost see an arc with the Doctor sort of Pertwee changing how he's taking the Doctor away from the Kung Fu fighting Doctor to like more of a space explorer and more of a man who's got a little bit of sadness, right? There's a sort of pathos to him by the end of this episode that carries over into the rest. And even though you have Sarah Jane, there's still a little bit of lingering something with him that isn't quite the same as when we first met him. And I think that's really, really something that he did as an actor and did with his performances that's very nuanced. I think it's really interesting.
And I know we know this, and it goes a little beyond the scope of this panel in terms of the topic, but I mean, obviously, it's probably also a case of an actor incorporating things in his life and what's going on. Because, of course, like I was just saying, Delgado was tragically lost. And then moving into the next season, Katie Manning's going away. And I mean, we know from all the interviews, I mean, Pertwee himself was very much like, well, he kind of feels afloat because like a lot of his best friends are gone now. It's coming to an end. And that melancholy you're talking about really continues into the next season with a feeling not quite as funereal as some end of Doctor eras, but it definitely by Planet of the Spiders very funereal. But there is that feeling, and I like, to some extent, you got to figure, well, this is all just bleeding in from reality. I mean, there's no way he can hide that, you know, and so at best he can incorporate it and like use it for his character, but it was clearly kicking off here at the end of this season.
You know, and again, we talked a lot with this panel about real time, right? I don't think any of us can really experience the gravitas of losing Roger Delgado that everyone associated with the show at that time felt.
Yeah.
And I think that as much as we think that affected the production, I think it probably affected it way more than people calculate, right? And I think, again, in real time, this would have been interesting to experience.
Well, on that note, do we have any more we want to say about season 10? Because we're kind of running out of time here.
I think the thing about season 10 is you get a lot of things thrown at you to process, and at the end of it, it all more or less works. To me, although Planet is not my favorite of the Dalek stories, I do think that it makes me think about just how much better the Pertwee Dalek stories are than a lot of people want to think they are. They're kind of dismissed a little bit. I also agree with you about Barry Letts. But I think that, the thing that really sticks with me when I think about this season is that the outside of the shoulder pads, because we get the shoulder pads and Three Doctors and the little puffy poodle, that outside of the recurring bad shoulder pads we get all season, I think that the spirit of adventure that runs through every story and the sort of determination of it's a little more urgent. There's a little more sense of urgency than there was urgency and determination than the other Pertwee seasons. I think that also permeates through, and it's interesting too.
I think for me, it's something I come back to with this season is in many ways it feels like Doctor Who maturing. We've had he's been stuck on Earth and he's like railed against being stuck, but we open the season with him getting his dematerialization circuit back, and he doesn't leave because he's built these bonds with these humans and his unit family. And at the end of the season, even that choice doesn't save him from loss because humans have their own lives and they make their own decisions. But he accepts that. And it's like we've said, this little bit of melancholy, but also I think a kind of maturity in the storytelling.
I have nothing to add to that.
All right. Well, let's wrap this up. Thanks again for being here. If this is going to be part of Console Room 2023's virtual broadcast for the people attending virtually and for the people attending in person. I myself will only be attending virtually at the convention, but if you want to discuss these matters more with me, you'll be able to find me easily on our Discord for Console Room. I'll also be one of the moderators in there in the Discord, so if you're having trouble figuring out the whole Discord thing, come find me. Anybody else have anything you want to promote?
You can just read more about a huge swath of fans discussing all manner of Doctor Who things in various volumes of Outside In. from ATB Publishing at atbpublishing.com. And I'm just going to quickly plug that I also do a little cartoon strip called Pickles and Bean that you can find at picklesandbean.com. It's almost finished its first year, so happy about that.
Yeah, I also want to say too, it's a little off base, like your comic strips it sort of is, but I do a music podcast called Modern Musicology that you should check out as well. And then also, if you're a really big fan of exploring Doctor Who by seasons, the Watchers in the Fourth Dimension podcast went through season 10 and did it for their podcast, and that's a really good discussion of this season as well. That sort of is a nice yin and yang to this. They went way more deep dive into it than we did. But if this is something you want to explain or explore deeper, that might be a place to go. And just no matter what season you like, what Doctor you like, dive in and find an area of the show you don't necessarily know about and discover it again, because that's the magic of the show.
Absolutely. And come chat with me on the Discord. You can also find me at writing-related activities on Tumblr.
Thank you, everybody. Good day.